like to get more creative with your fabric scraps, but you're just not sure how to approach it? We could be missing out on a whole heap of fun if you could just learn how to be more receptive to their potential. My guest this week is improv quilting artist and teacher Sherri Lynn Wood. Sherri Lynn defines the two types of creativity as active and receptive. As garment sewers, we are used to actively creating the garments that we've envisioned. However, Sherri Lynn encourages us to access the second type by playing with fabric scraps and existing textiles to see what we can create without a clear idea of the finished outcome. Whether that play becomes a quilt, a garment, or something else. So stick around a few minutes for that, plus details of a free workshop that you can sign up for. Welcome to Check Your Thread, the podcast that will help you sew more sustainably. My name's Zoe and I'm obsessed with sewing. I've been blogging about it for over 15 years and am the creator and host of the popular handmade wardrobe challenge Me Made May. But, like many people, I've become increasingly concerned about the climate crisis and the way that my lifestyle contributes to it. So in this podcast, I'll be nerding out about making clothes whilst exploring how to minimise the negative impact that it may have. I really hope you'll join me in this journey. Hello, wonderful listener. Are you okay today? We are so close to the end of the year, and whatever that means for you, I hope you're not feeling too stressed out. I am feeling too stressed out, so I don't have any words of advice. I just hope that you're not. Right, so this episode is the last one for a bit. I'm taking 2 weeks off from making the podcast. I'm going to visit my husband's family, and then we're going to have friends and my mum come and visit us over the Christmas break. Check Your Thread will be back at the beginning of January, but in the meantime, if there are any episodes that you've missed or want to re-listen to, the next couple of weeks could be a good opportunity. If your podcast app doesn't allow you to go all the way back through the archives, you can access all previous episodes via the website checkyourthread.com. There's not been much sewing going on around here lately because of the aforementioned end-of-year stress and busyness, so I'll skip to a sustainability win. So this was pointed out to me by a lovely patron of the podcast, Polly. I was moaning to Polly in an email that most of the wrapping paper that I saved from last year had got squashed when other things had been dumped on top of the storage box throughout the year. Polly suggested that I try ironing the wrapping paper, or, failing that, scrunching it up and flattening it out to make the creases look more intentional. Well, the ironing of the wrapping paper worked an absolute charm. It didn't look exactly like pure virgin wrapping paper again, but it doesn't need to because presents never look like that once they actually reach the hands of the recipient anyway, do they? So I'm having a total duh moment over this because I press my sewing patterns all the time to get the major creases out. So why didn't I think of that for wrapping paper? I'm not going to share any sustainability failures this week because life is too hectic and stressful to dredge up any more examples of where I may have dropped the ball recently. But this week I do get to say big thanks to Helen, Birgit and Vicky. These three wonderful people have signed up to support the podcast via Patreon and I couldn't be more grateful. If you fancy giving the podcast a festive gift, please consider signing up to support what I'm doing here with small monthly donations. It would actually be the gift of longevity because it's only possible for me to spend time making this podcast because of the amazing patronage that the podcast receives. You can find the Patreon link in the show notes or on the website checkyourthread.com. So let's get on with today's episode. It was super cool to get to speak to Sherri Lynn because, as you'll hear, I actually took part in one of her free improv scrap play workshops 2 years ago. It had a big and very positive impact on me and on how I use my fabric scraps. Sherri Lynn will be offering another free warm-up session to the start of her upcoming workshop series. The free one is going to take place on the 6th of January 2024. So if you can, I thoroughly recommend signing up. You can do so by signing up to her email list, which you can do on her website, as well as finding information for all the other amazing looking workshops that she's got coming up. So I want to send you my love and my thanks for listening to Check Your Thread during 2023. I hope that it has been a little oasis of positivity and inspiration for you, no matter what kind of year you've just had. I'm honoured to have you as a listener, and I promise you that I have some phenomenal conversations already in the bank to share with you in 2024. So please make sure to keep Check Your Thread in your ears as you head into the new year. So please take care of yourself and your loved ones and those in the wider global community. Eat something tasty, iron your creased up wrapping paper, and enjoy.
Hi, Sherri Lynn. Thank you so much for talking to me today. I am super excited to be speaking to you because I attended one of your free improv quilt play workshops about 2 Januaries ago, and it had such a big impact on me personally and how I use my fabric scraps. And it's had just a lasting impact on really my kind of feelings towards scrap and leftover fabric as a resource. So thank you so much for that.
Well, thanks for having me here, Zoe. I'm really glad to speak with you about, sourcing sustainable materials for patchwork. I'm mainly a quilter now, but I started as a seamstress when I was like 10 years old. I bought a sewing machine, and so I'm really love that you're doing this with people that sew, right? Sew clothes.
Yeah. So I've had the pleasure of meeting you before, but for my guests that haven't had a chance to meet you before, could you please tell us who you are, where you are, and what fills your days?
Okay, I'm Sherri Lynn Wood, and I mainly am a quilt maker, and I do improvisational quilting as a creative life practice. I'm in Cincinnati now. I lived in the Bay Area for many years, and I'm from North Carolina. And I've been quilting. I started sewing in 1970, sewing clothes. And
Yeah, tell me about the evolution of your relationship with sewing. Then, so you started as a garment maker.
I did, and I, saved up my allowance and bought my first sewing machine on my own for $30. I mean, I actually looked up in a phone book and found when they had phone books, and found a place that sold sewing machines. And I'm like 10 years old.
Oh, bless you!
Dad, I told my dad I'm buying a sewing. The guy, I only had $30, and they had a machine for $35, and the guy gave me a break on $5. And I told my dad, we're going to go get a sewing machine. So he drove me out, picked it up, and my mom did not sew, but my grandmother was a drapery maker, but she would send me fabric sample books and then remnants from curtains that she made. And I don't know why she sent those to me, but she did. And I guess just to play with. And I was so inspired I just wanted to sew them together. And so that's how I got started. And my neighbor across the street, there was this older woman named Claudia who showed me how to use the sewing machine. And I made my first dress ever out of a piece of crazy paisley drapery fabric, really Baroque type drapery fabric. And all it was a tube. I put a button right here and had a white strap that went around my neck that held it on. It had 2 white pockets.
Amazing.
And that was my first ever garment.
I love it. Right. So you've been using reclaimed materials from the very beginning.
That's true.
So how did you go from that to improv quilt legend?
Well, I made my clothes all through, junior high, high school. I did costuming in the theater when I was in college. And then around the age of, I think, 24 or so, I made my first quilt. I just did, And then once I got exposed, especially to African American makers, Eli Leon's show of Who'd Have Thought It came to Chapel Hill, North Carolina, where I was living, and that was in the early 90s, and like maybe 1990 or something. And I saw it, and I was just so blown away. And then I really wanted to make quilts. But I started making more fixed pattern work and was selling it at the local farmers market in Carborough for 13 years. But soon after, I discovered the free form abstract piecing of Black makers like Rosie Lee Tompkins and R.B. Williams. I just got the bug, and I occasionally make clothes, but once I started quilting, there's so much freedom, especially when you're not following patterns with quilting, that it just became my life. And I've been doing it for many, many years now, over 30 years. And there's just a big evolution in my interests in quilting. And it led me to become an artist. I got my MFA in sculpture with my quilts. And I guess I see quilts as sculpture more than painting.
Interesting. That's so interesting.
And I'm also the author of the Improv Handbook for Modern Quilters, which is still in print. It's almost 10 years old, but they're still printing it. And so that's kind of where I am.
At the moment, what is your making practice and what does your work life look like at the moment? So you're still teaching online workshops. Do you teach in person at all?
Yeah, and doing some teaching in person, not as much, but I'll be teaching this summer coming in 2024 at Quilting by the Lake. I'm going to be teaching in France in September 2025. So I still do some, in-person teaching, but mostly I teach online classes. And I do a big workshop series every year. And this year it's going to, in 2024, the theme is found color. So I always have a different theme.
Yeah.
And really specifically working with how to use different types of secondhand clothes like t-shirts, denim, velour, sparkly stuff in quilts. And find the color and the texture in them. So that's
amazing. So you've got this new workshop series coming up. It's called Found Colour. So where did that title come from? And also, how do the individual workshops, how are they going to explore the different aspects of the idea of found colour?
Right. So it's also about the way we find color in ourselves intuitively. So we can learn about color like formally. Like these are, complementary colors. This is what value is. And we will be working with some of that. One of my favorite, the first class is 2-color, 0-waste t-shirt quilt. And we're going to do after image where you actually stare at a color and then you look at a white piece of paper and you see the after image, which is usually a complementary color, but trying to find that image internally. Because honestly, our eyes are all calibrated slightly different. I've even noticed that I see different color one eye than the other.
Really?
I have a little tint in one eye. It's weird, but if you start to really pay attention to the physical sensations of seeing color, so we're going to practice, becoming more aware of how we see color in the world, in the present moment, also tapping into memory and emotion. And I have taught workshops on intuitive color, and there's going to be a really great one. And I would recommend this one, especially for your listeners, the strip piecing intuitive color class, because we're going to work a lot on accessing color through memory. But also strip piecing is that is such a great way to use up scraps and to put them into clothing. And it's so freeing and fun. So if you want to use some patchwork in your clothing, like a panel at the top or something around the sleeves or something like that, strip piecing is great for that. Yeah, and when I've taught those intuitive color classes, it's really, especially going back to memory, it's really interesting.
Yeah.
People have all kinds of memories around color that they don't even realize. Sometimes they're not positive memories either.
Right.
And then they find out, I never used these pastel colors because I had this negative memory as a child, around pastels. and then it opens up. It acts, and then they realize they've never used those colors. Like we have blocks, internal blocks towards certain colors. Found color is not just about, it's about finding color and resourcing color in secondhand materials. And it's also about finding color within yourself and your relationship to color.
That is so interesting. I'm wondering if makers who are predominantly quilt makers, if they inherently have a different relationship to color to makers who are predominantly garment sewers. Because obviously I think with garment sewers, we are more used to maybe considering our skin tone or our complexion, our hair colour and things like that. And I wonder if there's things that we tell ourselves that we can or can't wear, in terms of colour. And I wonder if that impacts our colour choices. And I wonder also on the flip side, maybe those of us who are more used to engaging in colour because it's going on our bodies, we have a different, maybe like a heightened, like attraction to certain colours than people who are thinking of it in a more abstract, maybe art kind of discipline.
I get what you're saying. And you know what? I think it's true. I mean, I definitely know certain colors look better on me than other colors. There's just no doubt in my mind. I look really good in bold colors, and then more muted tones often just wash out my complexion. So I think that's a true thing, that you're going to have a different range of colors when you're working with garment sewing, and it is connected to your body. I also agree with you that we may have prejudices around that we're not fully aware of either. And on top of that, the other thing that's really funny is this just happens all the time. And maybe you've heard of this before, but so often when people are in a quilting class and they make a quilt in the class, like when I teach at QuiltCon or something like that, they end up matching their quilt. I mean, it just happens over and over again. It's like people wear the clothes, colors that they use in their quilts too. So,
interesting.
That is part of it. And that's, as a quilt maker, I mean, that's why, it's good to open up your range so that you can access, maybe more than just the kinds of colors you're comfortable wearing.
Yeah. Yeah, I found that I've got into a very narrow kind of select. Not right now with this cardi, but I've got into quite a narrow range of colours that I make garments from, and that's good because every time I make something, it's not a struggle to find other things to wear with it. But I wonder if I am limiting myself unnecessarily. That maybe some scrap piecing and some play could kind of loosen up a bit. But let's go back a little bit. So a lot of listeners of this podcast, as we're saying, are predominantly garment sewers or menders. So many will be unfamiliar with the various facets and movements within the quilt world. So can you tell us a bit more what improv, quilting and scrap play are for those who haven't heard those terms before?
Yeah, well, I mean, another term that's really good for the kind of work that I do is abstract piecing is another term. Right. Just meaning that you're working with shape and pattern in an abstract way, not trying to create any kind of realistic looking image. But improvisation itself, I mean, it's become a term just because we like to categorize terms, but it's really about the creative process, right? It's about the difference between planning and designing something out and then following a fixed route to get there, that even if it's something you've planned yourself, right, it's fixed. Whereas improv is more of a process where you're interacting in the moment, in the present moment. You've got a scrap of something sitting around and it catches your eye, it might end up in the quilt and unplanned, right? And it is a process and it is a practice, and it's pretty fundamental to any kind of creative thing. I mean, everybody that is alive improvises. We're improvising right now as we're speaking because I don't know exactly what question you're going to ask next, and you don't know what I'm going to say. So every conversation is an improvisation. So it's just about tapping into that process of listening and responding in the present moment to the patchwork as it unfolds. The patchwork itself has an entity and life of its own as you start to make it. So you're paying attention to natural shapes that occur. You're cutting the shapes, but you're not using rulers or templates. So they have all kinds of odd edges and stuff, but then there's natural fits that show up and unplanned, and there's a lot of serendipity. So it is, a freeing, it gets you out of perfection. I think a lot of clothes sewing, is really about perfection. I'm sure there is a movement away from that too in clothes sewing these days too.
Definitely. And this is what I really discovered by going through your workshop. It was something that I wanted to explore more because I have all these, like many garment sewers, I have all these scraps and these leftovers of colours that I love and fabrics and textures and fibres that I like to interact with and make with. For me, it was really enlightening to see that it's not all about the finished thing. It's not like working towards a finished goal. You can have fun and allow it to unveil itself. And I think this cardigan, actually, what I'm wearing now, is quite a good example of this. It's just literally bits of knitwear that I had collected, and I was cutting up to make mittens and all sorts of things, and I just thought, I wonder if I could make a garment. And I really let the shapes of the knitwear kind of determine how it was going to go. And so this is actually quite a good example. I didn't put this on deliberately. I put it on because it's really cold in here. It's his wool. But yeah, so it just shows that the ideas that you were teaching in the workshop and more broadly in your work and other people's work in your kind of discipline, it has different applications. Like it could be a quilt, it could be a garment, it could be something for the home, you know, like it could be a curtain, it could be all sorts of things that if you allow yourself to kind of open up and play, you could see what it wants to be.
That's right. And, I mean, I love your cardigan right now and the large patches. It's not like little bitty patchwork. It's just like you've got big sections of different knitwear and it's beautiful. And, with somebody that's working with like a pattern for a jacket or a shirt or a skirt or something, it'd be very easy to resource other materials to just fill in those pattern pieces, right? And
yeah.
patchwork is very popular in fashion these days. You're seeing it everywhere. It is definitely something that can work great in garments. I love that you're doing that with clothing.
But so obviously there are a lot of commonalities between sewing to make quilts and sewing to make clothes, particularly in the practical sense in terms of the materials we use and the methods we use to join the fabric. But there's also a lot of differences as well, isn't there, in terms of what I was thinking about, for example, like you have to think of the function of the item and therefore, how it's you're going to finish it possibly or how you can launder it and stuff. But I'd love to hear what your thoughts are about the similarities and differences between garment making and quilting, but maybe from a bit more of a conceptual or the underlying kind of purpose in those things.
Well, I mean, the thing that, when you ask that question, the thing that comes up for me is just thinking about how much my start in making garments for for 12 years before I ever started making quilts have influenced the way I make quilts. I feel like some of the techniques that I've developed just to make my own quilts come out of my experience of sewing clothes rather than sewing quilts, because I didn't do a lot of fixed pattern work for very long, and I just went right into the improv and the free form. Early on started making quilts out of people's clothes as memory quilts, passage quilting. And so, I love the textures of fabrics from clothing and quilts. I find it just so interesting to work with the different textures. And I guess in a quilt, you can put all kinds of things together, but I just launder it. I launder all my materials ahead of time. If I'm putting wool in a quilt and I know I'm going to wash the quilt, then I just wash the wool the way I would wash the quilt before I put it in the quilt. And if it holds up, then I use it. And if it doesn't, I don't,
Yeah.
So you have to think of your function. I think patchwork is just a great resource for people that are making garments to make new types of garments. And I want to highlight, did your readers know of Sway Sew Shop in LA?
Yes. Well, I do. I don't know if all of my listeners do, but yeah.
So I always, at my workshop series, I always have guest speakers to kind of inspire us at the beginning of the workshop. And I have Isaac, who does the community dye bass, is going to be speaking from Sway Sew Shop. But I love what they do with the jackets and the patchwork and the remade things. I don't know, with garment construction, I think you can be improvisational even in the way you construct clothes, right? I mean, we rely on patterns a lot. I know me, I rely on a pattern a lot if I'm going to try to make some clothes. Like, I'll buy the pattern and cut everything to the pattern. But I think more experienced people may just be able to cut something up. And I do stuff too. Like, I convert men's shirts. I'll put some darts in, or I'll cut the sleeves off, and I'll cut T-shirts in different ways. And that can be very improvisational in your approach to structuring garments, right?
Absolutely. Remaking existing garments and using existing textiles. There's definitely a freedom. I mean, I keep coming back to the word freedom. There is a freedom that I think a lot of the time as garment sewers, we're not in a way encouraged to explore, and this is my view anyway, because of the rise in popularity of home sewing in the last 10-15 years. There's a big industry that has kind of grown up around that to provide fabric and patterns and notions and equipment, and they're beautiful. But I think we have been encouraged just to kind of consume those things, buy the pattern, buy the fabric, put it together, take a photo on Instagram, and repeat, you know. I mean, and that can be fun in and of itself, and it can be a challenge. And different people want different things out of their, you know, making time, and sometimes I want different things. Like sometimes I just want to make something because I want that particular garment, or because I just want to get into the flow and of just following somebody's steps. But sometimes I want something else, you know. And I think that increasingly, as people become, like more experienced sewers, they might discover that they also want to explore something else, you know? And I think also the fact that we have so many scraps and leftovers, I think more and more people who are becoming more mindful of the sustainability of their sewing, they are finding all these scraps and leftovers, feeling quite guilty about them, and maybe doing some little projects to kind of use them a bit, but out of a sense of obligation. And I want to encourage people to find more fun in that. And it sounds like that going through the lens of found colour is a really interesting way to find some fun in using what we already have.
Totally. And then you can also add, like if you have just a bunch of scraps from your clothes, right? Well, maybe it's not the right pizzazz that you need. You can go out and find a pair of purple corduroy pants that you can cut up, you know, secondhand, and to add a little bit of punch, or red pants or something, you know. You can have a lot of fun by just taking your scraps, mixing them. That's why the free scrap play class is great. And also, you know, some of the quilting workshops that I'll be teaching, you know, maybe take a quilting workshop, a free form shop, you know. So you have a few little patchwork tools. You don't have to make it into a quilt, but you can make it into a sheet of fabric that you can then make a garment out of. That would be one approach. Another approach is to play around with creating garments out of other garments, using your scraps to fill in. My friend gave me this cute little dog sweater that she made for her dog who passed away, and my dog's the same size. And it's completely improvised out of sweater pieces for the dog sweater.
Oh.
You know, it's like you can start small, right? Make a little dog sweater or something where you're improvising the itself. And, you know, it scraps anyways. So this is the other thing I wanted to make the point. You know, when you're using secondhand, quilters have a hard time with this too. You know, they buy precious fabric off the bolt, the designer fabric or whatever. And sometimes it's too precious for them to cut into if they don't know it's going to end up in being the kind of beautiful quilt that they want to have. And so that's why, you know, I encourage people to, you know, use secondhand materials. When I teach classes in person, I always ask people to bring some fabrics they don't want anymore, stash fabrics, and then people go wild. They really feel free to experiment with their ugly fabrics or somebody else's ugly fabrics, right? And they make beautiful things out of them. But when they have this precious fabric that they've paid a lot of money for, they're less likely to do that experimentation. So I think with garment sewers too, that's the case, right? Use your scraps, experiment. If it doesn't come out, whatever.
Exactly.
You know?
It was so interesting because when I was doing your workshop, it was on Zoom and there was a chat going on at the same time. I don't know whether or not I don't think you were looking at it because I think you were busy doing the thing, but It was really interesting watching the chat because obviously there was a lot of quilt makers in attendance that were maybe more used to the kind of more, as you say, the more
fixed pattern. I like to say fixed pattern.
Yeah, as in they're used to planning things and right, I need 80 squares of this colour and 40 squares of this, and they clearly were kind of more used to using quilting cotton than reclaimed textiles. And some of them were really kind of maybe struggling a little bit with like how to kind of get into it because it was obviously a new approach. And I was kind of making a joke in the chat but only kind of half joking because I was saying you should pair up with garment sewers because garment sewers have an abundance of leftovers and things that we're kind of not precious about. We kind of want to kind of pass on. But so I was wondering, like, when you're meeting people and teaching quilters who are used to making the planned things from quilting cotton largely, do you sometimes come up against some kind of resistance or trepidation about using different kinds of textiles?
Yeah, that's a good question because that's one of the things I'm hoping to do with this workshop series too, is to, what is holding people back from using secondhand materials or reclaimed textiles. And I think there's a lot of things. Sometimes people say they don't like the smells.
Oh, really?
Now, I guess that's not the case when you're using your own scraps from garment clothes, right? But that's it. Where do you source it from? Maybe you do have a friend that loves to sew clothes who wants to pass on their scraps. So there's another place to source reclaimed materials that don't have smells in them yet, because they're still like new materials.
I would also recommend, as somebody who works from a fabric shop, I work in a fabric shop one day a week, I would really recommend talking to your local garment fabric shop, because there's always ends of rolls or bits of a roll or a bolt that has a flaw in, and then they just get chucked into a scrap bin, and the volume that is created, they never want to put them in landfill if they can help it. So that's a good source without having to go, to a thrift store or charity shop.
And I love the offcuts of, that's really fun too, to work with offcuts. As an improviser, you have some shapes already to start with that start to inspire you, right? And I think some people, there's lots of things that hold people back. They're used to having, maybe they don't want to run out of a material. They find that as a limitation. Like if you only have one shirt, that's not going to be enough to make a whole quilt. So you're going to run out of that blue.
Right.
That to me is a creative opportunity, right? Instead of a limitation to shift colors, to change, to substitute colors. It's a whole different way of quilting, really. Fixed pattern and flexible pattern work have really different aesthetic rules in terms of what works and what doesn't work. Like having the same color all over the quilt doesn't work as well in a free-form pattern as it does in a fixed pattern. In fixed pattern, that symmetry and harmony is part of what makes it beautiful. So what happens is when people come from really strong fixed pattern traditions, they have so many unspoken rules and thoughts about aesthetics and everything that they have to completely unlearn.
Right.
So they have a harder time. And even in body memory, like I can cut a perfectly 1-inch strip, selvage to selvage, without a ruler. I mean, our bodies get so used to being precise that I have people in classes all the time that are disappointed that they're not a little more wonky, even when they're trying to be, because they're just so, they've just so got the body memory of the perfection. So undoing perfection, even on a cellular level, is difficult. If you come in with somebody who doesn't have any quilting background, and maybe even hardly any sewing background, they may be just like, whoo, they'll just be off the charts in what they can imagine and create, because they don't have all of these rules about doing things the right way yet.
Yeah. Currently, do you always use reclaimed textiles in your work?
I actually have so much material, really, and I have de-stashed my material over. I think I've been quilting over 30 years, more than once. So I'm not buying any new fabric, but I still have a lot of fabric that I have bought in the past. So I'm not saying that people should throw out all of their fabric that they bought at quilt shops. Not at all, right? But I do incorporate, anything that I get now, it's secondhand. And so I have a mix of secondhand materials and materials that not only do I get them at quilt shops, but I get them, when I teach, I always, like I said, when I teach in person, I always tell people, bring fabric you don't want any more to share. And I'll sometimes pick out things at the end of class that are there and bring home. So I haven't bought new fabric in a long time. And I'm really lucky because I have this huge, wonderful thrift store a half a mile from my house.
Right.
It's more of a curse. You can buy it by the pound there.
Right. That was gonna be my next question. Like, how and where do you source those reclaimed textiles then that you're getting?
Well, I get them from that place because it's so convenient. It's like $1 a pound. And then if you buy over 30 pounds, the price drops to like 75 cents a pound. So it's like you can get 50 pounds of fabric for like $30. That's a lot of fabric.
Yeah, that'll keep you going a while.
Yeah, no, and I try to stay away actually. But if there's something I want, like if I want purples to make a purple quilt, I just go there and, whatever purples. And you can use everything, you can use knits. Another place, though, is friends and neighbors, just say, hey, do you have any old clothes that are going through? I mean, people are constantly cleaning out their closets. It gives them permission, actually, to get rid of things, So go to your friends and neighbors and say, hey, I want to make a denim quilt. Do you have any jeans that you're getting rid of? Let me know. I'll take them off your hands. Another thing, I used to be in this group when I lived in Durham, North Carolina, called SWAP. It was Southern Women Against Purchasing.
I love it.
I know. We would meet, usually twice a year in the spring and the fall, and we'd bring out our old clothes that we didn't want, and we'd just have an afternoon party, and we'd just exchange whatever. And there would always be a whole bunch of stuff that would then go to the thrift store.
Yeah.
And so I would always, at the very end, after everybody's picked what they wanted, I would go through and it's like, I'll pick all the linen out. I'll pick all of the, the things that nobody wanted to take that had good fabric value to me. Using your old clothes can be really meaningful too. Clothes from your own closet. Make a family quilt where you take some old clothes from each member of your family, right?
Yeah. In fact, something that I asked improv quilter Heidi Parks when she spoke on the podcast, I was asking her if, when she's working with existing textiles, if she prefers to use textiles that she's had a personal relationship with in some way. Or is that how you feel? Or does it not really matter so much? It's more about the colour and the texture? Or
Well, I think it can be both. I think at times you might want to do something that marks some special occasion or some situation, and then having those meaningful materials that carry a story. And my thought has always been that back in the day, when people were really like spinning their own cloth or whatever, or paid a lot of money to making their own garments on a regular basis. They did use their scraps for quilts because that fabric was precious, and they didn't want to just throw it out because it costs a lot or it took a lot of labor to make. So they had little bits of their whole families in their quilts just without thinking about it. It was not an intentional practice, but it still probably carried a lot of meaning where they could say, oh, that's Aunt Sally's Sunday dress or whatever. Yeah, so I think when there's times when it's great to use those meaningful materials, but there's also times where you just want some luscious, sparkly or velvety or satiny ink in your quilt, right?
Yeah. You just want something purple, or you just want something green, or
Exactly.
yeah.
Why not? And also, I love. This is a whole nother level. This is something else about the found color. Is just like the way velvets or wools or satins absorb and reflect color is so different than cottons.
Sure.
And you just don't get that with the quilters cottons. But knits, oh my gosh, those beefy t-shirt knits. Going down the t-shirt aisle is like Rainbow Alley. Like the colors are so vivid. And t-shirts are not that hard to sew with and patch with, to make patchwork with. They're so soft.
If you're using a jersey, do you tend to back it?
No, that defeats the purpose, right? If we're buying backing fabric.
Depends if it's a reclaimed backing fabric.
Oh, okay. Well, I haven't thought about that. If you use a lining or something, but if I discourage people from buying like iron-on interfacing and things like that.
Yeah.
It depends on the t-shirt. If it is a really meaningful t-shirt that's really thin, and you want to do it because it's a memory quilt or something like that, then you might want to buy some backing or something to put it on. But other ways to back it would be to, use a lining from a jacket or something underneath it and stitch it down onto it to preserve it. So there's different ways, or you could put a organza or something light over it that you get from a garment to protect it. So there's different options.
Yeah. When you're sourcing materials, secondhand materials for your quilts, are there certain types of fabric and fibre that you always keep your eyes peeled, or any that you always avoid?
I think the main thing that I avoid is something that's too stinky. So and often it is like a poly blend or something like that, where the smell is just, you just know it's never going to release. But I like to go, it just depends on what I'm in the mood for. Like right now, I've been really looking for shiny, sparkly fabrics. But I also always love corduroy. Like I have a huge recycled corduroy collection. And I have a pretty big collection of wool and linen that's all reclaimed. Old holy cashmere sweaters, they can make beautiful quilts, right? Fuzzy knit, good knits. But I'm open to just about anything in my quilts. Not all my quilts are functional, but even, most of them could be functional, I think.
When you say functional, what do you mean? As in they function as to have on a bed or a couch?
Right. Sometimes they're functional where you would use them and sleep under, and sometimes they're more like hangings or art pieces that you would hang. The other thing about secondhand materials, I want to go back to this question of whether it has meaning or not. One of the classes I'm teaching that I'm really excited about is a very special class called Trailblazers, and it's a tribute to R.B. Williams and the Breeches quilt. We're going to actually work with the architecture of clothing. So it's kind of the opposite of what clothes sewers do, where you cut out the shapes for the body out of flat fabrics and make the garment. We take the clothes apart and actually use the architecture of the body, of the patterns that are made into the clothes in whole pieces. So you get a sense of the body in the quilt.
Interesting.
So the actual, shapes of the arms or the front plackets or the different architectural items, you have to sometimes pick and choose. You can't get them all in the quilt. And in this particular class, we maybe focus on one primary piece of clothing, like a dress, and then there'll be other patchwork around it. But you work with the actual architecture rather than cutting it all up into little bits.
Yeah.
And this is to tell a story. So people can take this class either to, maybe they do want to make a memorial quilt of somebody that has close to them who has died. But they could do something like go back to one of their little ones. Like, and maybe, like I had one person in a class once and she's like, she got a bunch of mini skirts from the store, not her mini skirts. I mean, she might have had some of her own mini skirts, but you can connect to your little one, like somebody, like your little child, your little inner child, or your 20-year-old, or your 40-year-old, or whatever time period, right? And resource materials that remind you of that person that you were at that age. And then use the architecture and tell that story, or retell it, or remake it, or make a new story about. We sometimes get stuck in old stories. So this helps us connect to those stories of who we were in the past and update them or celebrate them. Or maybe it's your future hero self. You pick the clothes that you connect to on that imaginative level and tell that story. So that's what we're going to be doing in the Trailblazers.
I love that idea. I love that idea as a garment sewer, thinking about garments that I've made maybe earlier on in my sewing career that meant a lot to me. There was something that I worked really hard on, or when I made it, it really felt like me in some way. And because you've got that strong connection, but maybe your style has moved on or your body has changed, kind of revisiting that. I think that's a lovely idea.
And you can make it into a quilt. You could take that old garment. I had one woman, this was one woman in my class a long time ago, Elizabeth. Her son was into theater when he was a kid, and he was going off to college. And through all these years, she always made his costumes for the theater. So she had all of these garments that she made for him for theater. And then when he went off to college, she took those garments apart and put them into a quilt for him.
Oh.
So I love that recycling of, first she made these garments out of material that she bought or whatever, and they've used and functioned in a certain way. And then she recycled those, reclaimed those, and put them into a quilt for him. And, so that it's just an never-ending cycle, and it can have that meaning.
Yeah, that's so thoughtful. That's such a sweet connection between the two of them as well.
Yeah.
So, okay, so let's talk practicalities for a minute. So, do you have any tips for harvesting fabric from existing garments? And then also, like, do you have any tips for like sorting and storing fabric and scraps as well?
That's a good question. One thing you can do is you can take things when you buy something that you want to use for patchwork or for garments. You can go ahead and take them apart by the seams and have them kind of flattened so you can pull them out. But I've also seen fabric stashes where, you just have a big bin of blues. Just put the shirt in whole, and when you want to use the blue, just cut out the piece you want and put it back in there. It just depends on how organized and neat you like to be.
Maybe how much space you've got as well.
Right. And sometimes I think, just having a bin with all my blue things, and then it's just like I look through and I find the blue, but then you have to pull it out. You have to iron it, to get all that. Sometimes I do, if I have the time, if I'm just sitting and watching TV or listening to a podcast, or I'm, not being super creative at the moment, taking out garments and taking them apart. If I have like a stack of corduroy pants, and I can just rip the seams or tear them or cut them. Sometimes I just cut the seams out. I don't try to keep the seams or keep every bit. There's certain things like I love doing curves out of shirt sleeves. I'll always cut the shirt sleeves out and kind of keep them separate because there's certain things about, and I guess, as a garment maker, you probably know, I feel like shirt sleeves are cut in a certain way to get a nice drape around the body and the curve. And it's amazing how easy it is to cut curves into patchwork out of a shirt sleeve wedge. It just works so well. So you don't have to think about the grain of the fabric, because when you're cutting a curve, you do want to think about the grain of the fabric when you're cutting it out of a flat piece of off the bolt fabric. But the shirt sleeves are already set up for you as a quilt maker to get beautiful, easy to sew curves out of. So that would be some elements. And I have some tips about, how to save the plackets.
Because they can look so cool, can't they? And existing pockets as well.
Yes, existing pockets. So you might like to cut out certain things. Like if you want to do a pocket quilt, keep collecting your pockets, right? You can have a bag of pockets, a bag of plackets, a bag of shirt sleeves. So there's things like that too that you can.
Yeah. That's making me think of, have you seen the work of the quilter Eliu Hernandez, who uses a lot of denim? He basically these days just uses jeans. He's made a quilt like of just denim waistbands, and then he has like where he's taken off the pocket and then what he calls the pocket shadow underneath, and so like he'll use that as well, and it's like these hints to its previous life. I think he made one recently that was, he took all the belt loops from jeans and unpicked them and then pressed them flat, and you've got all the the gradation of colour from where the wear has, and it was just amazing. It's so cool.
Yeah, I know. And that's what's so wonderful too about working with secondhand materials is that kind of surface design comes from human activity, interaction, time. I mean, you can't make that.
You're not going to get that from quilting cotton.
No. I did a residency at the San Francisco Dump in 2016 where I had 4 months to make an entire show out of 100% recycled material. So that included the batting, the backing, the thread, everything.
Wow.
And I found everything in the dump, including my tools. I found sewing machines and irons and ironing boards, scissors and everything. Although that wasn't required, I found them. It was just everything in the dump. It's insane. But, I made this beautiful quilt out of linen. I'm not sure what the material is exactly. Some kind of a linen, but a brocaded type linen for curtains. Clearly been sitting in somebody's bay window for, who knows, a decade or more. And it had these big fade lines. They were real tall curtains. It had these big fade spaces. And that's why they were thrown out. I mean, the material itself was not corroded. And then I was like, that's the whole beauty of the piece was the fade lines and the time and the sunlight. It's just magical, the beauty of that fabric. And it probably took at least a decade to create.
Think of all the things that those curtains have seen.
Exactly. And you can't make that. You find it and you collaborate with it, right? You unlock the beauty of the discarded
Yeah,
material.
that's beautiful, because I think a lot of the time when, especially as garment sewers, we think if we see fabric that's got a flaw or there's some wear, we think, oh, okay, I'm going to make a new thing, and then that will somehow have to get rid of that somehow. But no, like, let's embrace it. Let's see how we can. In fact, I'm wearing some dungarees that I've made from some denim.
Oh,
You can
yeah.
see I've got a pocket shadow there as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Embrace it and collaborate with it. To me, it's a different kind of creativity. They're both great creativities. You know, they're both valuable, and I think we switch from one to the other. But one is more of an active kind of, I'm going to imagine this and I'm going to make it, right? And there's something that feels great about that. Like, you imagine it, you design it, you make it, and it's real. There's something empowering about going from this zero, nothing existing, to thinking it and then making it. But then there's also receptive creativity, which to me feels like it's a completely different kind of process and practice. And for me personally, it's more mature. Like I had the first way of making for a long time, and this more receptive way of making didn't happen until later on. But that's where you're receiving, you know, you're actually more of a conduit, and you're respecting the materials and you're listening to the materials and you're seeing what it wants to be. We're helping that come out. And that, I think, is the difference between fixed and flexible type pattern making too, of, you know, being receptive and collaborative with your materials and allowing it to, you know, have a say in what it becomes.
I love that. I love that. That's completely how I'm starting to see. Yeah, you've just described exactly this kind of new exploration that I'm in. And you're right, there is these two different paths, and they both have their benefits and they both have their joys. But I want to expose more garment sewers to the more receptive side.
Yeah, and it's a different feeling, and it is a lot of uncertainty. You have to be on the edge of the unknown because you can't fully conceive it ahead of time. It takes a lot of maybe confidence, or I don't know if it takes confidence, but it takes trust, willingness to trust, and curiosity to explore and to be a beginner. And, you know, with garment sewing especially, you feel like you have to master it, right? When I was a kid, it was really important that it didn't look homemade, but I think it should look homemade. I mean, if you're going to make it look homemade, right? Because goodness grief, all that work I want to be proud. Like, look, I made it myself.
Yeah. And that's what I think is really interesting about this new wave of interest in hand sewing garments, because I think immediately as soon as you hand sew a garment, like fully, no machinery, just hand sewing, you're chucking that out the window, that idea that it's going to look like shop bought, you know?
Right.
So do you do your piecing by machine and then your quilting by hand?
Most of my piecing by machine. There are times where I need to hand piece, and that goes back to the different materials too. Like some, like velvets, are almost impossible to sew and piece together on a sewing machine. I mean, it's not impossible, but can be really frustrating. And sometimes it's just easier to do it by hand. And it's just like, slow down. If you want this beautiful piece of velvet in this spot here, slow down and do it by hand, and you'll get what you want, you know, but it might just take a little longer.
What about batting and backing fabrics? Do you have a similarly free approach to those?
Yeah, well, you know, when I did the dump, that was one of the hardest parts, was finding the material for the batting. And sometimes it was mattress pads. But, you know, people would throw away brand new mattress pads. I mean, of course, I washed everything before I put it in the quilt. You know, I could find mattress pads, but I would have to sometimes take off some of the fabric just to get the batting part. But sometimes I would find a beautifully quilted, sometimes it was even cotton on both sides, already quilted. And so that became my backing and my batting. So then I would just stitch through that whole quilted thing with my quilt top on top.
So I've been thinking about this, because thinking about kind of trying to do things in a more sustainable way, there seems to be so many in the charity shops near me, people chucking out sleeping bags. And I've got a couple of sleeping bags here as well that, like, the zipper's broken, so we sometimes just like stick it over like a kind of thing. And I just think, like, it's so ugly. What if I made like a nice quilt topper I mean, it's probably synthetic, but do you know what I mean?
You certainly could. And, back in the day when people's quilts wore out, they would just stick their worn out quilt in between their new quilt. So if you find old quilts, sometimes you'll find another quilt inside, right? That's
Really?
worn out. Oh, yeah. That's what they did back in the day. Like they would make a quilt, and who knows what they put in the middle of the first one. But, maybe carded wool or something that they got off the farm. And they'd make a quilt, and then it would wear out over time. And so they would just resource that worn out quilt with the patchwork and everything and put it right back into the next quilt with a new piece top, right? So you'll find old quilts that have another old quilt inside. So, yeah, you could do that with that. And, the other thing that I thought would be great for batting is the microfibers. Those, all of the microfiber blankets that you find, and they're bad for the environment and stuff, but they're better if they're encased.
Yes.
If they've got cotton or wool or something, a tighter fabric around them, that's going to keep those microfibers contained, and that stuff's really plush and soft. So if you can get the smell out of them, you can they're really abundant right now in the stores. You can find those everywhere, and I think those would make really good, fluffy, warm, and you would be helping the environment by encasing that microfiber because it won't wash out.
I bet you could go on Free Cycle or like your local Facebook group or whatever and just say, does anyone have any sleeping bags or microfiber blankets that you don't want anymore? Maybe there's a stain or they look a bit ratty now. You could get them for free.
You can get them for free. I mean, there's so many out there running around. I mean, it's hard to find like a nice wool blanket anymore. That's woolen. But you can find those microfiber blankets. That would make great insides. But when I do buy batting, I like to buy wool batting, just 100% wool batting. My favorite is made by Fairfield brand. That stuff is beautiful for inside quilts, and I love that. It doesn't have any kind of sizing or anything in it. It's just 100% wool, and it works great.
Brilliant. Right. So where can people find you and your work, and how can they sign up for all the events that you've got coming up?
SherriLynnWood.com is my website. If you go on there, you'll see information about the Found Color series. Sign up for the free workshop. You want to sign up on my mailing list to get on that. And there's going to be a link, you'll see a link to it too, maybe on the toolbar or on my class page, but you'll find it all on the website. And you can also find me on Instagram at Sherri Lynn Wood. The other thing, if you're interested in quilting, I don't know how many of your viewers are budding quilt makers or improvisers. I do facilitate. It's a creative mentoring community around quilting, and it's called Brave Patch. bravepatch.school is how you get to that.
Brilliant. I will put links to all of those things in the show notes. And I just love your website as well. It's so beautiful. It's so inspiring.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Yeah. I love your newsletter. I love your website. I love your Instagram. It's such a visual feast for sure. And there's a lot of colour to be enjoyed.
I'm glad to hear that. Thank you so much, Zoe, for having me on Check Your Thread. I love that.
Yes. Yes. Thank you so much for this. This is really, I'm gonna be thinking about this a lot, and I'm going to be processing a lot of the ideas because I think there's so many parallels and there's so much cross-pollination in our disciplines.
And my classes are really always designed to get people to be thinking and creating improvisationally. So even if you're not a person that's totally into making quilts, having that practice with the quilting may open up your improvisational practice with your garment making. And one of the things when people do sign up for my classes, I have a talk on just improvisational process that's pre-recorded that I invite people to think about just the process of improv and how it is part of our daily lives.
Well, I can definitely attest that your approach is applicable to other mediums apart from quilting, and it's definitely had a big impact on my own sewing. So thank you so much, Sherri Lynn.
Thank you for having me.
thanks so much for listening. I really hope you enjoyed this episode and are left feeling inspired. For more info about the podcast, including show notes for this and every episode, head to checkyourthread.com. I'd love to hear from you, so if you have any comments, questions or ideas for future episodes, please get in touch by emailing zoe@checkyourthread.com or find me on Instagram @checkyourthread. Massive thanks to Patrick Potter for production support, to Sylvia Seller for the awesome logo design, and to Simon at Palm Skin Productions for the music. This ad-free podcast would not be possible without listener support, so if you feel you are able, please consider signing up to the Check Your Thread Patreon. For the equivalent of buying me a coffee each month, you'll be making it possible to continue producing regular episodes. Links can be found in the show notes and on the website checkyourthread.com. I hope you'll listen again next week. Until then, take care. Bye!